There's a revolution in my science too, natural sciences. And I think COVID, for many people, has destroyed the reputation of medicine.
Science?
And
Yes,
science.
well, that's what happens when, see, because we haven't segregated out the religious and the political properly, the political has become religious. And so now science is being drawn into the fray. Follow the science. The science does not tell you where to go. In fact, it's specifically designed not to do that, right? In its purest form, science is a value-free enterprise. Now, it can't be because you have to select the objects of study, right? But having done that, it's supposed to be as value-free as possible, which means that in some sense, technically, it is directionless. And so then when you hijack the science and you say, this is what it tells us to do, you politicize and you even make religious the science. Well, then people think, well, I don't trust your politics, or maybe your religion. Now I don't trust science. Well, that's not helpful at all. And part of that's abdication of responsibility. It's like the scientists aren't politicians. They can't balance the risks. It's like, you know, there are things we could do to make us safer from COVID in the short term, I presume, maybe. But what about the medium term, and what about the long term, and what about all the other issues, the economic issues, and the loneliness, and the suicide, and the breakdown of families, and the isolation, and the theft of years from young people's lives? Well, that's a political issue, and the science does not tell us what to do with that at all, ever. And to say that it is to abdicate your responsibility, and also to claim for your own beliefs all the virtues of science.
You know, I've been saying that when you mix medicine and politics, you get politics.
Right, exactly.
And I did a session, actually, it was a Vatican event, and I had a bunch of religious leaders who all happened to be doctors. And I asked them if they had been involved in any of these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have thought there would be enough humbleness within politics, or political leaders, I'll say, that you would crutch a little bit on belief systems that might actually influence how people saw the world when you're dealing with a crisis like COVID, where you don't have all the answers. Mm-hmm. And that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. When decisions were made to shut down churches or to make a value judgment, as you point out, that science just didn't have enough data on, you want to consult science, mm-hmm. but you don't want science making those decisions, because that's not the day job we're trained to make. And then mm-hmm. there became an arrogant reliance on what the science showed, even mm-hmm. though it was still a rapidly evolving process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's led to the dramatic number of people who've refused vaccines.
Of course it is. So lots of people, and they say outright, I'd take the vaccine except you're making me. It's like, are you wrong? It's like, I don't know. Are you wrong? So what's more dangerous, the government or the virus? Well, it's the virus. It's like, well, that's because you are temperamentally inclined to believe in the solutions of government, but those other people aren't. And they're not wrong, because governments are dangerous too. So there's no doubt that that's happening, and it is going to cause widespread disaffection with science. The climate issue is exactly the same thing. The science says, follow the science. Follow the science, or you're ignorant. Follow the science. That's your philosophy of science, is it? Are you sure it's the science we're following, and not your wish to ally your political beliefs with the science, and to prove that you're right with all the might of the scientific enterprise behind you?
So how does that translate into practice? You're the leader of a country. You've got a virus coming your way. You see a communist country take a pretty draconian stance mm-hmm. on it and seem to have success, but you don't know, because you don't know if what you're hearing is right. And all the scientists are telling you, go right, and no one's saying go left. So what's the rational approach, which is perhaps different from the right approach?
At the individual level, it's try to clear your mind of unnecessary preoccupations and do what your conscience tells you, and then we all have to talk. I don't know what the right move forward is, you know.
Not the right move, the right strategy.
Yeah.
If there was a right move, I would hope you've told us. I'm actually arguing for a process, a way of, which is what you're so good at, a way of understanding what the real questions are.
Well, I think part of what we have to contend with is the fact that if you have to force people to take medical action, then your arguments were insufficient, and that's your fault. If you can't entice people into that, then you failed. And you should examine the reasons for your failure instead of increasing the force with which you're applying your arguments. You know, and I think it was maybe something like in Canada particularly, because we have enough vaccines for everyone. It's like, here are the vaccines. You have a choice. We think they work. We don't know everything about them, but they seem to work. You can get them whenever you want, because all you have to do is go to your drugstore. We've made it as easy as it's possible to make it. We're going to open everything up. You take your chances after that, and we hope that you protect yourself the way you see fit, and if you don't and you get sick, we'll still take care of you. It's something like that, I think. It's certainly not, those anti-vaxxers, they get what they deserve if they get sick. It's not that, that's for sure. And forcing people to take medical action. I mean, I know this is a complicated debate, but I don't see it. I see it causing more problems than it's going to solve.
Were you surprised at how easily so many gave up their rights to decide for themselves? And likewise, the number of people who are absolutely resistant to moving forward, even when there is a fair amount of data supporting, for example, that getting a vaccine, probably long-term, at least short-term, I'll say, is probably in your best interest. Mm-hmm. Those groups seem pretty steeled.
Well, I think it's a reflection of all the underlying political problems that we've been discussing. It's just manifesting itself in this particular crisis. With regards to the initial lockdowns, it's a herd move in some sense. It's like there's a chaos and crisis. What is this endemic, this pandemic, how serious it is? Well, the Chinese moved first. It's like one animal got spooked and we all followed in the midst of this crisis. And, that's understandable, I think. But then there's time for sober secondary reflection. It's like, oh, yeah, what about our civil liberties? And yeah, what about them?
The anger against people who rethought that first step just seemed dramatically more than I, as a scientist, would have expected, in part because I realized the science wasn't as solid. You couldn't be arrogantly criticizing a country's effort to do their best for their citizens based on the science.
Right.
This happened, for example, with Sweden. I'm not even going to judge whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing, but to my view, and as a scientist, the more different ways people try, the more I might learn.
That's a process, isn't it? Is to allow for variability in the response and then to evaluate. That is what scientists do. Yes.
It was a suffocation of that process which caught me off guard. Did that strike you just as a student of the world we live in?
Well, I do think it's predictable in some sense, given our current political situation. It's the contamination of politics with what should be religious presuppositions, and that intensifies everything to a tremendous degree.
And 100 years ago, when there was a boom after the Spanish influenza, which led to, in some countries, or at least it was at the time when the Soviets took charge, communism in Russia, and 10 years later, actually Nazis were already rising in the 20s, but 10 years later with Hitler truly coming to power, there were experiments done which seem similar to what's happening now in some parts of the world, including here. Those lessons don't seem to have been remembered very well.
Yeah, well, opponents to this insistence upon a certain course of medical treatment, they have those sorts of things in mind. And those are the people who are perhaps more afraid of governmental overreach than of the virus itself. There's an app I discussed with John Anderson, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia several decades ago during a very effective administration. He's a very solid person, in my estimation. We talked about that app they have in Australia that enables you to take a photograph of yourself and specify your location to the authorities. It's like it is by no means obvious that app is less dangerous than the virus. So now, you point that out and people get mad because in some sense, you're forcing them to rethink things, and that's really annoying. People hate that. Once they've made a decision, they hate having to rethink it, and no wonder. And then there's all these underground issues that are happening. So your objection gets tossed into the the bad mouthings of the basket of deplorables, let's say. So we can't have an uncontaminated discussion of this.
I don't know if it was as accidental as sometimes it seems. I mean, Stalin's real name wasn't Stalin, right? Stalin means man of steel. He picked on purpose, and he never believed in convincing people. Right. He believed in tempering people. That's what a steel man does. You temper the steel. Yeah. Mao believed that you would condition people, so they would naturally think what you think they should think, so you don't have to bother convincing them. I think a lot of people who are resistant are fearful that the people of our countries are being conditioned to think in a certain way.
That's right. They're afraid of the underlying ever-present totalitarian impulse. Sure, that's what they're afraid of.
Yeah, it's that impulse, not even the government, because if all of a sudden right now there was a draconian government that came into power, people would revolt. But a few years from now,
right, it's that impulse, and it's potential for manifesting itself incrementally. Of course, that's what they're afraid of, definitely. And the more conspiratorially minded people are more afraid of that than everyone else. And and are they wrong? Well, probably, but maybe not, right? That's the thing. It's the more extreme beliefs are probably not true, but sometimes they are. And so
paint me the picture of what happens if we don't address this, if we don't actually have an awakening within academia and our culture.
We get a chronic pandemic and an increasingly authoritarian government at the same time.